A guy shot 2 Minnesota lawmakers along with their spouses. A female lawmaker and her husband were killed, and then a male lawmaker and his wife were wounded. The one who was killed is Melissa Hortman, former Speaker of the Minnesota House. She and her husband were shot and killed at their home early Saturday. The notable aspect of her political career is she's a Democrat. So instantly you say, okay, well, it's got to be a right-wing Republican who shot her. She's a Democrat, but she was the only Democrat in the Minnesota House to oppose funding health care for illegal aliens. So she's a Democrat, but she voted with the Republicans. She was the only lawmaker who was actually killed. A second state lawmaker, Senator John Hoffman, and his wife were shot multiple times and appear to have survived. Then we don't know who this guy is, but the police take a photograph of his car, and there are No Kings flyers on his seat. So No Kings, we'll get to that in just a moment. No Kings was this kind of weak, astroturfed, completely cringe protest of Trump over the weekend. So he's got flyers protesting Trump all over his car. He goes out and shoots, allegedly, the only Democrat lawmaker who voted against funding healthcare for illegal aliens. But then there's some evidence that he's a Republican. So all of the evidence that we've seen so far makes you think this would be a Democrat, a far leftist, who's upset at a moderate leftist and who's upset at Trump. But then we find out the suspect is a 57-year-old guy. And he, even though it looked like his car was law enforcement, it seems he was just posing as law enforcement. It wasn't a real law enforcement car. We then find out he's got a LinkedIn or other kind of resume that said that he owned a security company. So you say, okay, that sounds more like a right-winger. It says he did security work overseas, but then actually there's no evidence that he ever did any of that. It might have been just totally made up. It might have just been quite just as fictional as the fictional police car that he drove to commit the crimes. Then we find out, on top of all of this, that he was appointed to a state board, the Workforce Development Board, by the super lib Democrat governor Tim Walz back in 2019. So then you think, okay, I guess he's a lib, but the board was nonpartisan, and I guess he had been appointed to another board by a Republican, maybe, and then they interview the roommate. The roommate says that this shooter was a Trump supporter. So then you say, okay, he's a Republican, but then the roommate says he actually hadn't really talked about politics much recently. And then we get the text. So the alleged shooter sends a text to his roommate saying, first of all, this is like a 57-year-old guy who seems like kind of a loner. He's got roommates. Doesn't seem like he's living in a great family situation. Seems like he's making up a fair bit of his resume. Says, I just want to let you know that I love you guys both. I don't want to say anything more and implicate you in any way because you guys don't know anything about this, but I love you guys and I'm sorry for all the trouble this has caused. Totally bizarre. They then interview the roommate about the alleged shooter's security background. They said, yeah, we basically just played pretend. We played pretend cops, played pretend army men. And he wanted to get a security company off the ground, but he couldn't. I think he worked in the food industry or a convenience store or something. So this is really bizarre. This reminds me of Butler, Pennsylvania. This reminds me of the attempt to kill Trump. Because just as in this case, in Butler, Pennsylvania, the alleged shooter, I guess I don't need to worry about him suing me for slander or libel. That's why we say alleged in journalism is, you don't want to be sued for slander or libel, even if all of the evidence points to the guy. But in this case, that guy had his brains blown out. So I guess I don't need to say alleged anymore, just force of habit. That guy was ostensibly a registered Republican, but his only political donation ever were to Democrats, and he obviously tried to murder Trump. So you can't quite pinpoint his politics. Same thing with this guy. He, I guess, said he was a Republican and liked Trump, but then he had the No Kings anti-Trump flyers in his car, and then he attacked a Democrat, but it was the Democrat who disagreed with the other Democrats, and sometimes political violence, sometimes violence is motivated by politics, by ideology. That does really happen, and it tends to happen more on the left. You see a lot of political violence on the left, basically none on the right. So I'm not discounting that. Sometimes ideology motivates violence. Sometimes religion motivates violence. Sometimes terrorism, which is targeting civilians for political purposes, motivates violence. And sometimes people are just kind of crazy. And I know that's going to seem like a cop-out to a lot of people, but it's really not. It expresses a truth about human nature that in secular modernity we don't want to acknowledge, namely that the perversity of the human heart is much deeper and broader and much less predictable than we acknowledge in modernity. We think human beings are like computers and we just kind of figure them out and we run an operating system and that's that. No. Concupiscence and the perversity of the human heart are a lot more complex than that. And this guy might have just been kind of a weirdo. And the fact that you can't quite place him politically speaks to that. And the fact that unlike in Butler, Pennsylvania, where there were these totally inexplicable security failures, and where you're talking about Trump, and it's right before the RNC, and it seems like there might have been, if you're going to suggest a conspiracy, that one makes a little more sense, that there were so many just inexplicable errors apparently leading up to that. The timing was so on the nose. In this case, though, no one had really ever heard of these state lawmakers. What was this about? It might just have been a crazy guy. That was a great clip. No, your computer didn't freeze. I'm just waiting for you to click the subscribe button. Subscribe so you get more great clips, and then we can see more of each other. I would enjoy that. See you next time.